Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are, whatever time it is. Welcome to this presentation on Visualising ISO 55001. ISO 55001 is one of a suite of documents, commonly referred to as ISO 55000, but in actual fact there's three separate documents, ISO 55000, ISO 55001 and ISO 55002, that together make up a suite of documents that is now the commonly accepted international standard for asset management. I guess that suite of documents is part of the ISO, the International Organisation for Standardisation, their management suite of standards, and so it sits alongside other management standards that you might be aware of, such as ISO 9000 for quality management, ISO 14000 for environmental management, and so forth. So ISO 55001, which we're going to look at shortly, is in fact the specification document. So it's the document that contains the statements of requirement for those organisations wishing to comply with the standard, or indeed to certify against that particular standard. So as I mentioned, the ISO 55000, although we talk about it as ISO 55000, actually consists of three separate documents. There's ISO 55000, which is a document that provides an overview of the topic, talks about some of the key principles, but most importantly, in the context of this presentation, also defines the terminology which are used in the specification document. So it's an essential read if you're looking to align yourself with ISO 55001. ISO 55001, as I mentioned, is the requirements document that contains the requirements, the statements of requirement that are required to be complied with if you wish to align yourself with that standard. And depending on how you count them, there's a lot of shall statements in there. The exact number, I guess, is subject to interpretation, because some of the clauses in there say, the organisation shall, and then has four separate bullet points underneath that. So, do you count that as four shalls, or do you count that as one? But suffice to say that no matter which way you count it, there's a lot of shall statements in that particular document. And then ISO 55002 is a companion document to the first two that provides some guidelines, I guess, in terms of interpreting what's in ISO 55000 and ISO 55001. So if you are looking to align yourself with the standard, then it's highly advisable that you buy the entire suite of documents. You certainly cannot just read ISO 55001 in isolation. So if you've read ISO 55001, you've realised that there's lots of words in there, and so what we're going to do is try and present that in a slightly more pictorial fashion. ISO 55000 has a suite of documents, basically provides guidance around what's good or best practice, perhaps more good practice than best practice in the context of asset management. And ISO 55001, the specification document, groups the requirements under a series of headings that are listed here on the slide, in terms of understanding the organisational context, leadership, support, operation, and so on and so forth. So how does that fit together pictorially? And this is a picture that we've put together that we think is useful in terms of understanding how the document is structured. So what we really see in this document is the standard plan, do, check, act cycle, so planning, operation, performance, evaluation, improvement, within a particular organisational context that is supported by leadership and driven by leadership, but also has the necessary support processes and support elements in place to ensure that those particular activities are done well. So let's examine each of those areas in a little bit more detail. Looking initially at organisational context. So the clause headings in ISO 55001 underneath the general heading of organisational context consist of a number of key elements, which are basically around understanding, what your business is about, understanding what your business's strategy is and what the implications of that are for your asset management strategy and for your assets, understanding who the key stakeholders are that can impact on your organisation, and in particular can impact on your asset management system, and understanding what their needs and requirements are so that you can align your asset management system in accordance with their needs and try and meet as many of their needs as you can. There's also a statement in there that you need to define the scope of your asset management system. So what we mean by that is which assets, in particular, which assets does this asset management system apply to? And so it is quite possible for an organisation to have part of its assets certified under this particular standard. So for example, if you're a multi-site mining organisation, you may well be able to have one of your mine sites accredited against ISO 55001, or alternatively, if you were a utility and you had a power electricity distribution arm and you had a gas distribution arm, you could get the gas distribution business unit and the assets that contained within that certified against ISO 55001, but not necessarily the other parts of your organisation. And there's also a requirement, I guess, in terms of organisational context, to ensure that the asset management system is properly defined and documented. So I've kind of summarised there. There's, as I said, there's lots of shells in here. There's lots more detail in here, but this gives you hopefully a bit of an overview of the sorts of things that are contained within that element. And in the standard, in ISO 55001, all of those requirements are covered under Section 4 of that particular standard. The next key area is leadership, and leadership is absolutely essential. And so a number of elements that need to be demonstrated here. One is that senior management needs to demonstrate their commitment to the asset management system and making that asset management system work. So, again, there needs to be evidence that they are engaged and involved and driving this system, and that the decisions that they are making are aligned with the documented system and so forth. But then I guess there's a couple of other key documents that belong under this element. One is an asset management policy, not necessarily a huge document, probably more in line with the sorts of things that organisations often have with regards to safety policies or quality policies and so forth. But again, it needs to be signed up to and endorsed and authorised by senior management and the leadership of the organisation. And there also needs to be another document called a strategic asset management plan that basically at a higher level is indicating how the asset management system and the assets are going to be made to align with the organisation's strategic plan and its strategic objectives. How do asset management objectives link to the organisation's strategic objectives and so on? And there's also a requirement on leadership to ensure there's clarity around roles, responsibilities, and authorities within their asset management system. So, clearly people need to understand what they're supposed to be doing, and then that needs to be documented and clear. So that covers leadership, and that's covered under Section 5 of the standard. The next major element, we start to move into the plan, do, check, act cycle. So we've got the planning element here, and there's really two types of plans here. One is plans for the asset management system. So what are the plans for managing and improving your asset management system, the way you manage your assets? And then there's another set of requirements around plans for the assets themselves. So, whole of life asset plans, understanding all of the key activities that need to be done to our assets in terms of designing, constructing, installing, operating, maintaining, and ultimately disposing of those assets and so forth. So that covers the planning element. That's covered in Section 6 of ISO 55001. Then we move into operation. And I guess that's reasonably straightforward. It's really about making sure that there is proper operational planning and control. But in addition to that, making sure that if there's need for changes in the way that assets are configured, operated, maintained and so forth, then there's due processes in place for ensuring that proper management of changes is taken into account for those changes, and that all of the business implications of those changes in terms of impact on costs, benefits, risks are all understood and taken into account. And there's also a requirement that if any of those activities that are actually performed to deliver asset performance are outsourced or contracted out to other organisations, then there needs to be elements in place to ensure that those contracting organisations, that their systems and processes are aligned with the processes and systems of the organisation that is doing the contracting out, the asset manager or the asset owner, depending on the context. So they're the key elements in terms of operation, and that's covered under Section 8 of ISO 55001. You might be wondering what's happened to Section 7. We'll come to that in a minute. The next element is around performance evaluation. So really what we're talking about here is putting in place the appropriate metrics to monitor, measure, but also the management systems to evaluate and control the performance based on those measures. There's also requirements around an internal audit process, that how are you planning to internally audit compliance with your own processes, and also a requirement around a periodic management review of the whole asset management system to make sure that it is actually achieving what it's intended to achieve, and does the asset management system as a whole need to be improved or realigned. That's covered under Section 9 of ISO 55001. And then we move into the improvement part of the cycle, and that's really around non-conformity and corrective actions. So those of you who are familiar with ISO 9000, you'd be more than familiar with non-conformity and corrective action type work. So when we do detect a discrepancy that we haven't complied with our own internal processes, what do we do to correct that and bring that back into line? But there's also requirements for preventive action. So rather than waiting until we have a non-conformity, what are the things that we put in place to make sure we don't have those non-conformities arising in the first place? And also a requirement for there to be some form of commitment to and demonstrated process for continual improvement of the asset management system as a whole. And that's covered under Section 10 of ISO 55001. And then the final element are the support elements. And what's covered under support is really a number of things, such as resources. So we need to make sure that we have all of the appropriate resources in place in the right quantities and at the right place, and of the appropriate quality. And by that we mean obviously human resources, the people side of things, but also additional resources such as support equipment, facilities, those sorts of things. There's also a requirement in the support element for there to be demonstrated an understanding of what competences are required within the organisation to make your asset management system work, and that there's appropriate processes in place to evaluate current levels of competence and plans and actions in place to address and bridge any competence gaps that might exist there. There's a requirement also for there to be awareness on the part of all those people who are part of the asset management system to understand, how they fit into that whole system, and in particular, what the consequences of them not complying with the system are from a total business perspective. There's also a requirement for communication, which is more than the awareness. I guess the awareness tends to be for those people that are actually involved in the asset management process. Communication is really about communication not only with those people but also with external stakeholders and so forth, and clearly that needs to be two-way communication. So there needs to be a communication plan, set up a communication strategy, so outlining what is to be communicated at what intervals, in what way, to which groups of stakeholders, and how is feedback to be gained from those people as well. There's a requirement around asset information in the support area, so clearly you need to have sufficient information about your assets, their condition, their performance, what they are, and so forth. And that includes, the financial aspect of information as well. And there's finally requirements around documentation, and again, for those who've been involved with quality management systems, you'll understand the requirements around document control and version control and access to documentation and so forth, to make sure that people are actually working with the latest version of those documents. So they're really the key elements within those areas as well. Which section of ISO 55001 does this deal with? It's the missing section 7. I'm not quite sure why support is taken out of order of the rest, but hey, I wasn't directly involved with developing the standard. I'm sure there's very good reasons for it. So that does actually sit in the document slightly out of order, perhaps conceptually, with the others. Once again, I reiterate that there's a lot more detail in the standard itself. There's lots and lots of shells, and one of the key things is around those shell statements is some of them can be fairly general. I guess by its nature, ISO 55000 applies to a wide range of organisations in a wide range of industries, and so the statements are by necessity in some instances reasonably vague and uses terms like, things have to be done to an appropriate level in your organisation. And so one of the key challenges, I guess, for organisations that are going to get involved in aligning their processes and systems with this is understanding what might actually be appropriate. What might an external auditor, if you're looking for certification, consider to be appropriate for an organisation in your industry. And so having that sort of fairly broad knowledge across industries, but particularly deep knowledge within your industry in terms of getting assistance if you're looking for external assistance, and certainly with certification and gap analysis, is going to, I think, be a fairly important element of making sure that you get the results that you're hoping to achieve out of your work in terms of aligning your organisation with ISO 55001. So that's pretty much it. That's the visual diagram, if you like, in summary of what ISO 55001 looks like. I hope you found that useful and interesting. If you've got any questions, feel free to contact me. The contact details are on the screen. And in particular, if you're looking for training in ISO 55001, if I can be allowed this plug, Assertivity does run we've got a 2-day training course on implementing an ISO 55000 aligned management system, asset management system. It runs in Australia, in various locations in Australia. If you're interested in that, then by all means look it up on the website, or give me a call, drop me an email, and I can give you the details for that. I hope, as I say, that you found this presentation interesting and useful, and I look forward to the potential of hearing about your success with ISO 55000 at 55001 at some point in future. Thank you.